Senator, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, David.
So are you aware of children being sexually abused and then returned to their abuser?
What I'm aware of, and being a long-term local, and somebody who's fought to be in the position that I am, because I'm acutely aware of the circumstances on the ground in a place like Alice Springs, is that I've been approached by many foster parents who are deeply concerned about the kinship rule when it comes to the foster care of vulnerable Indigenous children, that Territory families take children who have been in loving, caring foster homes and then place them back into communities that they've actually not really known all their lives. For example, there might be a child, a 6-month-old, put into the care of a foster family who then take care of that child, meet that child's needs in a suburban home in Alice Springs with everything that they require, paediatric support, specialist learning support, all of those things. And then by the time they turn 6 or 7, there might be somebody who says, I'm kin for this child, I will take responsibility for this child. So, but that person is living back out in a community that doesn't have the services available, where there's known predators in some of those communities, and those children have been re-traumatised, put back in those circumstances, and in fact, yes, sexually abused again, and then again, Territory family steps in once that's happened and put them back in foster care. I know this is happening. And these are the sorts of stories that Peter Dutton heard on his visit here. And while the media have turned this into a beat Peter Dutton up exercise, the truth remains he was here because of his concerns, because the community has been calling out for leadership to come and address these concerns. And while Peter Dutton has made 2 visits, the Prime Minister, I have to remind everyone, the Prime Minister made a 3-hour visit to Alice Springs and left and then spent 3 days at the tennis. Locals on the ground, if the media were in fact at all interested in understanding, were really very upset about feeling like they've been completely ignored. These issues have been issues that I have been campaigning on for a very, very long time, because the concerns of locals, they're beyond themselves right now, and they're calling on leadership in a bipartisan approach to address these issues. That's what's going on.
I want to come to how to address these issues, but just coming back to the question though, are there specific cases that Peter Dutton's talking about of kids being returned to the hands of their abusers?
This is what I'm saying. So these are the concerns of foster parents and people who have had these experiences. They have been through these experiences. So these aren't made up claims.
Do they need to be reported to police then?
They've gone through the processes. It is failings by Territory families to actually uphold the human rights of these children. And the basis of this is because they are Indigenous kids, and the priority is to put them with kin, even though that kin may be living in dysfunctional circumstances. This has been an ongoing issue, but one where you can't put a spotlight onto unless you have a royal commission, because the fact that foster parents, their stories cannot be heard publicly. It's about protecting the identity of these children.
I'll come to the Royal Commission,
but this is what happens.
Sticking with the immediate concern for kids, does Peter Dutton, or indeed yourself, Senator, need to report any of this to police? Are there kids right now who are being put in danger?
Look, David, we're not stupid. Peter Dutton is a former policeman. He knows what needs to be done. I'm talking about circumstances where these things have taken place, where Territory families has known about these circumstances. Well, if that's what the territory families know about them, I'm assuming that they have reported that. I know foster parents have. They've done the due diligence and they have done the reporting in these circumstances.
But are you just assuming that this has been reported? Shouldn't you, under the mandatory reporting requirements laws, report this to police to make sure?
David, what I'm saying is This is what has been done. The problem isn't this, the reporting's been done. The problem is the way in which the system is failing these children by putting them back in these circumstances. I mean, we're talking about situations where some of these foster parents are actually police themselves. This is the problem. They're fighting a system where they know that they're very concerned because Territory families are against recommendations and advice from experts such as paediatricians, child psychologists are saying to them, do not put these children back in these dysfunctional circumstances, and yet are doing that.
So who's making that call? Is that Territory families? That's just so viewers are aware. Are you suggesting Territory families are putting kids in the hands of abusers? I mean, that's a very serious allegation.
That's right, and this is what foster parents have been telling me. This is what foster parents have been telling me, and I have no reason to believe that these concerned parents are making these stories up, especially when I've heard them over and over again.
And are you passing any of that on to police?
Of course. Like I said, there are circumstances where foster parents themselves are, in fact, police. And I'm talking about foster carers who are also Indigenous, who have come to me with these grave concerns. So this is why we need a royal commission into the sexual abuse of Indigenous children.
Well, let me ask you about that. So
we can't deny the fact that...
Sorry, you've been talking about this for years, right, about the problems of violence there. Do you think another inquiry is really the best answer? Aren't there things that can happen now, should have happened by now?
Look, I think the inquiry is absolutely called for. It is absolutely called for because, as we're saying, you know, I'm being questioned, Peter's being questioned as to, you know, it's almost as if we're not being believed in this situation, that these parents are coming to us with these concerns. So therefore, an inquiry would in fact demonstrate that there are these foster parents out there who need to be heard for the sake of the children that they care for, because their voices are those that need to be heard with all of this. And you know, there's like this sense of shame or denial around Indigenous kids. It's like we can't talk about that. You know, they're not given the same reverence as someone like Grace Tame is given when they want to be heard, when they want their voices to be heard, because they're Indigenous kids. And somehow there's a shame that comes with that. We've got a sense of cover-up that comes with that. I'm over it, to be quite honest.
Well,
I've had enough of it.
I think we're talking about it here this morning. So is there anything, though, in the absence of an inquiry that you think needs to happen on the ground?
Yes, I think we've also seen recently there's been articles in The Australian about a young man who wants to be adopted. I think the child protection system needs to change to stop this separatism of Indigenous kids being treated differently who aren't being removed because they're Indigenous, because authorities don't want to be seen as being racist because of the stigma of the stolen generation. And we need to uphold the human rights of children, Australian citizens in this country. And Indigenous kids deserve to have their human rights upheld. I mean, during Senate estimates, I asked the Human Rights Commissioner for Children what they were doing to uphold the human rights of these Indigenous children. She sat there dumbfounded without an answer. I mean, we are, as a society, ensuring the continued neglect and abuse of these kids because we're too afraid to step in and do something, and that needs to change.
So what right now needs to happen?
We need to remove the kinship aspect. We need to say that children who are living in circumstances where their human rights are being upheld should not be removed for the sake of putting children back with kin. Because I'm also aware of circumstances where there are some kin who know that there is money involved with raising a child, so they will put their hand up for the opportunity to have more money in their pocket and not necessarily provide that child with what they're the love and care they're supposed to have. I've heard many situations where that's happened, these are all the things that we need to be taken into consideration.
That kinship requirement is, as I understand it, a preference. It's not about potentially putting a child in danger, is it?
Well, I think it is. 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 It is the priority. It is what's seen as what should come above everything else. And I know of circumstances where children have been put in danger because of that provision.
What about what the federal government can do? I mean, you're in the federal parliament now. Do you agree the government is spending money in the right ways, the money that's being put into night patrols, youth services, women's domestic violence support and so on? Are these the right areas?
Look, I think the action plan, which that previously the coalition government had invested heavily into, the Centre for countering child exploitation, where the coalition government invested $70 million into. I think all of that is very valid, and we have always taken the bipartisan position to support that level of support, but it is incumbent upon, I think, state and territory governments to do the right thing when it comes to child protection. And if there was ever going to be, the only sort of referendum I would support right now is if we put the lives and the responsibility of children into the federal arena. That's a referendum I could get behind, because I think we absolutely need a review of how that is or isn't working across the board.
Running child protection.
Absolutely. If it's actually doing it from the perspective of upholding the human rights of our children, regardless of racial heritage in this country, then that's something I would support.
What about a local Indigenous voice? Would that help the situation in Alice Springs?
If those voices are prepared to actually be honest about the issue, as opposed to what we're seeing, we're seeing SNAICC, who was supposed to be the national representative body, trying to downplay this issue instead of recognising the sorts of things that I'm certainly been brought to my attention to tackle it from that particular direction. I mean, I'm interested in people who are interested in the truth as to what's going on.
So a local Indigenous voice,
embarrassed or stigma.
Do you support the idea of a local Indigenous voice?
So I support the idea of regional and remote legislated bodies that would represent issues going on the ground. That's what I would support. That is what the coalition supports going forward.
And exclusively Indigenous voices you're talking about there?
That's the idea. That's the idea.
Okay, because you have been warning, I mean, since your first speech in Parliament, about the Indigenous voice giving powers to one group of people based on race, driving a wedge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but you do think local and regional Indigenous voices are okay?
So what I have advocated for is, I don't believe in separating us along the lines of race within our Constitution. What I have always advocated for is the voices of people in remote and regional communities to be amplified, because of the circumstances in those regional remote communities are very different to other communities. Someone from somewhere like Balgo, Docker River, Yuendamu, Indigenous voices from there are very different to Indigenous voices from suburban Sydney or Brisbane or even Alice Springs. And their voices in the bush are often not heard, are not amplified in these discussions. Even more so, the vulnerable voices in those communities are not heard. But it is often those with the loudest voice who can exert the most aggression who are heard.
Okay, if you had all these local and regional voices for the communities you're talking about, how would they be heard in Canberra? Do you need a national voice, a legislated national voice at least? As I
said, I support voice bodies that are representative of those regional remote areas. As I've said previously, in my work with the Centre for Independent Studies,
to funnel their views through to Canberra.
Their voices would go to Canberra, as far as I'm concerned, from the grassroots
through a national voice to
Canberra, through those regional voices. direct to Canberra through those regional and remote voices. That's what I would support, because as I've outlined in my research in the Centre for Independent Studies, the gap exists between remote communities and the rest of Australia, including the cities where there are services available to all people, including those of Indigenous heritage in those places.
This question of having a national voice. Your Liberal Senator colleague Karen Little says there would need to be a national voice to allow those regional voices to speak to Canberra. Do you agree or disagree with that?
So what I'm agreeing with is that I support voices from regional and remote communities to be heard in Canberra. That's what I support. That's what I've always supported.
How does that work?
That's what I've always fought for. Well, the coalition government, the previous coalition government made a commitment of $32 million to do prepared work to create that. Right. So that hasn't been done, obviously. But that was also based on the Coleman-Langdon report. And the emphasis for us is about amplifying the regional and remote voices who aren't heard over the top of those that are already being heard from urban parts of this country and the cities.
Just a final one, Senator. Do you think we need in Australia to have a minister or indeed a shadow minister for Indigenous Australians?
I'd say so.
And why is that?
Well, ultimately, that's supposed to be the voice that represents Indigenous Australians. And I guess our Minister for Indigenous Australians just the other night witnessed firsthand the violence in Darwin when she assisted a stabbing victim who then later passed away. And, perhaps maybe that is what will actually drive the Prime Minister to do something about the situation going on the ground in the Northern Territory.
And would you like to be
role.
As far as the shadow role goes, we heard you earlier in the week, you've had some conversations with Peter Dutton about it. Where's that at? Are we likely to see you take on that job?
Well, that's a decision for Mr. Dutton and for the leadership. No matter where I'm at in Parliament, I'll be doing what I can to advocate for the vulnerable, as I have done. So, and working hard is all I'm interested in doing, no matter what role that might entail.
All right, we will see. Senator Jacinta Price, appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.